This is week 80 of our weekly discussions, and we're asking whether effective altruism is actually effective. So effective altruism is two things. It's an idea and a community focused on using careful reasoning and evidence to find the very best ways to improve the world and then to act on that basis. Practically speaking, this involves a lot of content being written about what effective altruism looks like, a lot of community where people get together and discuss these things. Also practical steps like donations to effective charities, pursuing effective careers, and advocating for the most important pressing causes. So I want to ask whether effective altruism, this idea in this community, really is effective. And these views are my own. I'm just presenting a hypothetical case, more for the contrary, and I'm presenting it as space for discussion. It's not necessarily my final position. So what would it mean for effective altruism to be ineffective? That's a really good question, and I have a few ways in mind that we might conceptualize this in shorthand. And to summarize, those ways would be: one, EA perhaps has the wrong values; two, EA perhaps prioritizes the wrong causes; and finally, EA perhaps doesn't execute as effectively as it could. So unpacking these one by one, maybe EA has the wrong values. So if we consider what EAs typically value, or people in EA, we could say that maybe there is a bent towards consequentialism. Maybe on average, many effective altruists are a bit more utilitarian in their ethics. Maybe it's a bit too consequentialist based off what the correct values are. And I don't think that consequentialism is always mutually exclusive with virtue ethics or deontological ethics. Sometimes you can have consequentialist, like actions that are right in a consequentialist ethical theory that are also right within a deontological theory or some kind of virtue theory. But maybe that's not the case with EA. Maybe it's possible that effective altruism, the movement, the ideas, the community, is too consequentialist at the expense of duty and virtue. Or perhaps effective altruism, or people in effective altruism, generally have the wrong idea, or a profoundly incomplete idea of what good or goodness is. Maybe effective altruists focus too much on welfare and hedonic welfare measures, or just focusing things on happiness and pain. Maybe there's too little understanding of goodness as something that incorporates meaning or relationship with God, or maybe justice or some other values that we think are important. And related to this, perhaps effective altruism is too maximizing, or maybe it emphasizes impartiality more than it ought to. Maybe it's too demanding. Maybe it doesn't recognize side constraints for ethical obligations that we have. Maybe it's overly influenced by a few thinkers lacking in diversity in ethnicity, religion, or philosophical thought. Again, these aren't all things that I necessarily believe, or that EA for Christians believes, but these are, I guess, logically speaking, possibilities. So maybe EA has the wrong values, but maybe EA also prioritizes the wrong causes. So traditionally speaking, effective altruism is cause neutral and is open to any range of cause areas or world problems. And traditionally, it's focused on four main ones: poverty and global development or global health, animal welfare, EA infrastructure building the EA community, and existential risks, and maybe with that long-term risks. So maybe it's the case that this simplification of EA causes really misses out on the full spectrum of the most effective causes. And I don't want to insist that these four this conceptualization of these four categories is like the final EA conceptualization of cause areas. Maybe it's just more traditional conceptualization. But it's possible that one of these key EA cause areas is very ineffective, or maybe even counter-effective. Maybe I mean, with some of these, it might seem to many of us like quite hard to imagine that being the case, but maybe not for all of these. And maybe it's possible that a key EA cause area is orders of magnitude more effective than every other EA cause area. And so it would maybe feel like EA as a movement was ineffective if any one of these, let's just take these 4 given cause area breakups, was substantially more effective than the others. If EA is distributing its resources roughly equally among them all, then it might feel as if EA is ineffective because it's not prioritizing that one cause. It's just way more effective. Perhaps there's something that is super effective that's not even encapsulated under effective altruism in the traditional cause areas. So I think it's almost certainly, I mean, it's certainly true there are really effective causes that EAs don't talk about. I think it would make sense to talk about EA being ineffective if the most effective causes and if like significantly effective causes were just grossly ruled out, and or if causes that the EAs put tremendous amount of attention to were absolutely ineffective. So one final way that we can think about EA not being effective is maybe like wrong execution. Maybe how EA, the community, the ideas, how they're practically implemented, it's just ineffective. The operations just fall flat. Even if the values and the causes are right, there might be significant shortcomings in how the community operates, how numerous key EA orgs operate. And then it might make sense to talk about EA being ineffective in that way. Some examples, maybe there are cultural problems within the community that EA brings about. Maybe there's not enough emphasis on personal health. Maybe it's like extremely demanding and grueling. Maybe it leads to burnout that's counterproductive. Maybe this tendency to be rationalist becomes an overly rationalist tendency and even hubristic, leading us to make claims about how we can affect the world that are just not in line with reality, or maybe even prideful. Maybe as Christians here, maybe we see elements of effective altruism that, just from a Christian perspective, are particularly against the virtues that God wants us to aspire, or against the goodness that God has planned for the world. Maybe there's so much talk about theory and action, that theory over action, that action never happens. Or maybe there are even negative externalities from effective altruism onto non-effective altruists. I think we can imagine cases where you might have, to take one example, which doesn't perfectly cross over to EA, you might have an evangelist of some cause who speaks extremely loudly, vocally about this cause, in a way that maybe makes people who aren't fully on board with the cause feel excluded or marginalized. And maybe EA talks about giving effectively in a way, and giving with our minds in a way that makes people who aren't natural born effective altruists, so to say, who aren't wired the way that many effective altruists are, maybe feel excluded. Or perhaps some EA orgs are flawed in significant ways, some evaluators or some grant makers. Then it might make sense to talk about EA being in some ways ineffective. So again, these are just like playing devil's advocate, lots of different possible ways we might talk about EA being ineffective. I'd love to hear like what your view is, and I'd like to see where you see the greatest need for improvement. And maybe it's helpful to address specific values or cause areas or ways that EA is executed that could benefit from something. Also, are there areas where EAs have like just an incredible amount of impact that you're convinced about? Maybe there's some specific thing that the EA movement does that you think is just like fantastic, and this is like potentially the greatest impact of EA, and vice versa. Maybe there's some aspect of EA that produces a great unintended harm. Finally, is this discussion and EA in general too navel gazing? Does it focus in on itself too much? That might be one way that EA is ineffective that I didn't mention earlier. So love to discuss these with you all.